Good morning, everybody. I'm gonna go right into our third of these online lectures, I think. Um, and I just wanted to remind you all to send your questions to me, so I know you're seeing these, and um, we can talk further about what it is you're looking at. Today, I'm going to talk about work that is about capturing time, the use of the smaller camera as that became more and more popular, how people use that to record the world as it is. I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see it. Um, but quickly, let's just go over some review from the last chapter. The first people we talked about last time was Jacob Riis and Louis Hine. Jacob Riis was photographing in the New York City tenements in the Five Points district of New York. Photographing the horrible conditions that people were living in his way to bring about change. And Louis Hine was photographing child labor throughout the country in order to bring about new child labor laws. Um, then there are the Native American photographers, people like Edward Curtis, who was not a Native American but was photographing the cultures and ceremonies that were either gone or on their way out, using sort of a pictorialist lens, which is somewhat problematic, looking for the noble savage, but at the same time it is a record that we otherwise wouldn't have. And below is Horace Pula, who is a Native American of the Kiowa tribe, who is photographing his community of Native American people. There is the two versions of the African American experience. On the left-hand side here, you see James Van Der Zee, who, among other things, was photographing the funerary portraits. Here is this woman with her deceased husband. Then there is the Hampton album, which was hugely problematic in that it was just a document of this school where that taught African Americans the white way. And below is another photograph of, I believe, James Van Der Zee's of a young child on the street, and that was another thing that James Van Der Zee would do. There's a physiognomics, excuse me, looking at how people are similar and different and trying to decide what that means about their personality traits. And finally, the FSA and the Photo League. The FSA, born out of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, was a government agency that set photographers out to document the conditions that people were living in migrant camps as well as throughout the country. And the Photo League was a group of mostly New York photographers who were photographing injustices throughout the country. So, as I said, today we're talking about the idea of catching time and anticipating the moment. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Jacques Henri Lartigue, who actually started out as a photographer at the age of 7. And I am not kidding when I say that. He learned how to use a view camera at that age and was obsessed with it. He came from a wealthy family, which certainly helped all of that, which is during the period called the La Belle Époque, which was a period of cultural and peacefulness in France. He then worked as a commercial photographer all his life, but it was his childhood albums. They weren't discovered until he was 69, when he had a show at MoMA in 1963. So most of his work, though, was he considered himself an amateur, although he did work professionally. So Lartigue, he, like I said, learned how to use the camera when he was 7 and continued on as an affluent amateur for his entire career. That spanned a changing world that included automobiles, bicycles, and airplanes, which was also part of the culture at this time. The world was moving a lot faster. In these images, you can understand his excitement for the lightheartedness and high energy. He was really looking at this sort of the good times of the world. And like I said, many of his images were made during La Belle Époque, which was a peaceful, optimistic, and cultural renaissance in France. Um, Soon after he mastered the view camera at age 7, he convinced his father to buy him what was called a hand camera. And the smaller camera afforded itself to a 7-year-old's aesthetics, like placing it directly on the floor to document his racing cars, as you see on the upper right-hand side. And it made things less financially risky, where he would make daring photographs, such as the one of him in the tub here, where he balanced the camera on a board to photograph himself with his water glider. The hand camera also made it possible for Latigue to chronicle his fascination with motion and speed, and all of these things that were in the fledgling stages of transforming the world. He also photographed celebrities as he got older. On the left is Zizou. And his work would be collected into albums that really read like family albums, especially his early work. He used what was called a block note camera, which is a smaller early small camera that had a maximum shutter speed of 1/300th of a second, which made the task of pushing the releasing the shutter at the right moment crucial to composition. So really thinking about the moment. And he compared this to playing tennis. And he said, one had to foresee the exact moment beforehand and have the ability and training to act consciously without thinking. Again, here you see this idea of the industrial age, early airplanes, but it's all done as a moment, not industrial at all, and about sort of the playfulness of it and exact moments. He never in his life received any formal training, but through persistence and continuing photographing, he could show life coherently and organized it with his own specific voice. And he was one of the early people to experiment with color, using the Lumiere's autochrome process, making images of life in full color. But again, there's a composition with the oranges on the ground, people set off to the side. So really thinking about the frame. And he considered himself a painter. He was a painter, but nowadays he's much more known for his photographs. And he really wasn't known even as a photographer until 1963, when he had this show at MoMA, which he was about 70 when it was shown. But his work remained influential to photographers for decades. People like Richard Avedon, who you see on the left, and possibly even people like Cartier-Bresson, where you'll see this image later of this moment caught in action in the air. So we need to talk a little bit about cameras and how this changed everything. There are these breakthrough cameras, the Urmanox and of course the Leica. Kodak had originally made a 35 millimeter film, but it was meant for the film industry. It wasn't meant for stills. Oscar Barnack designed the Leica, and it wasn't the first, but it was the most popularly used 35 millimeter. And that down there is the very first Leica, which I believe there's only a handful that exist in the world. They're very, very rare. But it was marketed as a handheld camera in 1924 with interchangeable lenses and a coupled rangefinder, making it much, much more user-friendly. Up top, you have the Urmanox, which is also a small camera, little box camera that used 6 and 4.5 sheet film, not a roll. So it needed sheet film, a small piece of sheet film. But it had a fixed f2 lens, meaning that it's a very fast lens and very shallow depth of field, but very fast. and very fast shutter speeds up to 1/1000th of a second. And of course, the Rolleiflex produced the first medium format roll film in 1928. So one person to use the Urmanax and use it sort of as a sneaky camera. You can see how small it is. He's holding it right there. But he is Eric Salomon, who he began his photography career in 1928, where he was already in his 40s, I believe. And he used that fast lens allowed him to work in very low light. So he would go to these courtroom and political events and photograph very quietly while he would sneak his camera inside of his bowler hat and take candid pictures. He's considered the father of photojournalism, modern photojournalism, and he was a Jew who fled Nazi Germany to Holland, but he ended up, during the occupation, he was captured and sent to Auschwitz, where he died. So he discovered photography in 1927, and soon after that he bought his first Urmanax. And that small size and fast shutter allowed him to photograph, to be pretty inconspicuous as he went to these trials. So he would sneak it in his hat, as I mentioned, and he photographed things like the Krantz trial, which I had to look up myself, but it was a major murder trial in Germany in 1928. And these images were then published in Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, which launched his career as a photographer. So they were published as news photographs. And it led him into to cover many different international diplomatic conferences. Here it is, a photograph of a bunch of old white men at The Hague. And then in July, this photograph here called "Allez voilà le roi des indiscrets." Pardon my accent. So in July of 1931, the Chancellor Brüning and Curtius, who are the German chancellor, they visited Paris at a banquet, and it was a banquet held in their honor at the Quai d'Orsay. The French Prime Minister, Briand, learned from his chief of protocol that press photographers had not been allowed in. And so Briand doubted this and wagered that at least one would be there. And so he peered around the room, and when he finally discovered Salomon, he called out, "Allez voilà le roi des indiscrets," which means, there it is, the king of the... I'm forgetting what that meant. I had it written down, but I lost it. It's the king of the, essentially he's saying there, whatever. Sorry, forgot it. So Salomon, who was Jewish, he fled Germany in 1932, as I mentioned. He traveled to England, France, and Switzerland. And he was living in Holland. He traveled around during the war to photograph, and it wasn't until the occupation where he was captured, and he spent 4 years in Auschwitz before being killed in 1944. And in this image, you can see how he would crop his images as well. So André Kertész, who's somebody who sort of starts using photography around the same time as Salomon, but in a different way. He was Hungarian-born, and there's a big typo there. His name is not André, it's André. I don't think that's two E's. But the rest of his family were stockbrokers, and he just took to photography. He moved to Paris in 1925, where he worked at VU magazine, where he met other young modernists, Dada, surrealist artists, and he achieved critical success. So a lot of this early work of Life in Motion is really tied in sort of deeply to the surrealist movement, and had a lot of response from them. So Kertész was using the language of modernism, such as asymmetry, close-ups, distortions, reflections, and unexpected points of view. He had three distinct phases of his career: in Paris, or in Hungary, in Paris, and the U.S. And he was very successful everywhere, but struggled in the U.S. and he took commissions to work in magazines after emigrating to Paris. So he was a professional photographer. Kertész, his approach and vision allowed the view to reshape reality, as you see in this image of a swimmer underwater, the light refracting and distorting the figure to create an unusual sense of perspective and an abstraction of the human anatomy, which is one of the things that led the surrealists to really latch on to him. He also would walk the streets to find scenes of the unexpected, using quick compositions to reframe the narrative. As well as sort of looking just at things like light and shadow in this image of this fork, where it's something that simple, but it's the starkness of the white table, the shadow cast below it, the bowl, and it really, in particular, when you think about that black line up top and how that without that becomes a stark image, and that very simple detail of leaving that black line up top helps to keep the image grounded in some reality. So 1936, Kertész moved to New York City, but the American picture press felt his images talked too much, and his work retreated. He retreated more into empty urban architecture, which is upsetting because he had such an affinity to photograph sort of the humanity. But this early work, inspired so many photographers, like both the founders of Magnum, the Magnum Photo Agency, which I'll talk about in a little bit, Henri Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa. Brassai is somebody who actually studied with Kertész. He's also Hungarian, born Gyula Halaj, and he took the name Brassai from his hometown of Brasso, Transylvania, where he had trained as a painter in Budapest and Berlin, but he moved to Paris in 1924 to Montparnasse, which was the the artistic neighborhood, the Williamsburg of France, Paris, where he worked as a journalist. And he actually started using photography to document his articles before he became really enchanted by the medium, and then was tutored by Kertész. So inspired by his teachers, who was photographing on the street, Kertész, he became really enchanted with this idea of photographing at night and these sort of forbidden scenes. So he would venture out to capture the deserted streets, its shadowed monuments, and those who only emerged after dark. So prostitutes, street cleaners, rag pickers, many of whom he captured in candid photographs, where a lot of these images were considered taboo. He would look for tableaus in cafes, things like young lovers, capturing them in this moment as an embrace. And I just love the framing of something like this, where you see his lustful eyes peering at her in the mirror behind her. He would also photograph in brothels, and places like burlesque shows, like the Moulin Rouge. And here is one of the street lighters at night. Again, people in cafes, the downtrodden, the drunk who fell asleep on a park bench. So moving on to Henri Cartier-Bresson, who's one of the major figures in photography. And as I mentioned before, in this image, you can kind of see where this leads back to Lartigue and that moment. He also, you'll notice a similarity with a lot of these people, they were painters first. So he studied painting and was aligned also with the Surrealists. He got his first Leica in 1932 and never really looked back. And we're going to talk a lot about this, but there's this phrase that kind of is really tied to him, the decisive moment, which is also the name of this sort of major work of his, where he would sit there and wait and for this sort of scene to arrange itself for the camera before pushing the button, Nothing was ever staged, and it was all about this intuition. Um, and the photographs were meant to be documents, not aesthetic. And then he's one of the founders of Magnum, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So this idea of the decisive moment, there's a cover of this book. The cover was done by Matisse, but the work inside is all photographs. But so this decisive moment philosophy that is used often, and his quote about it is, "Photography is not like painting. There's a creative fraction of a second when you are taking a picture. Your eye must see a composition or an expression that life itself offers you, and you must know with intuition when to click the camera. That is the moment the photographer is creative. Oop, the moment. Once you miss it, it is gone forever." So Cartier-Bresson had a strong fascination with painting really early on when he was very young, and particularly the surrealists. But it was in 1932, after he spent a year on the Ivory Coast, that he had discovered the Leica, and this small handhold thing that really set him off on a lifelong passion for photography. And so it was at that moment he started photographing. He joined an ethnographic expedition to Mexico, and in 1935 he would study cinematography also with Paul Strand. In 1952 he returned to Europe, so he also was photographing post-war Europe, and that was when he published his first book, Images à la Sauvette, and it's in English is called The Decisive Moment. And he explained this, another way he explained this term was, "For me, the camera is a sketchbook, an instrument of intuition and spontaneity, the master of the instant, which in visual terms questions and decides simultaneously. It is by economy of means that one arrives at simplicity of expression." And you can see here how he's framing and arranging the space. It was in 1947, also post-war, that with Robert Capa, George Roger, and David Seymour Chim, and William Van Devert, he founded Magnum Photos, which is still around today. It's an international photographic cooperative agency. So it's member-owned, with offices in New York, Paris, London, and Tokyo. And the major thing why this came about is at the time, like the FSA photographers were hired by the government, so they didn't actually own their negatives. Once they photographed them, they'd send the film back to DC where it would be processed, and they would never see them. And the Magnum did was it made it so that the photographers could maintain rights to their photographs. So every time that an image like this is published, Cartier-Bresson would get royalties for it, rather than getting a lump sum and then the magazine would get royalties. In 1940, he actually was taken prisoner by the Germans, and he escaped on his third try in 1943. So, which was one of the things that led him to found Magnum. Was dealing with the aftermath in Paris of World War II. He was still coming to terms with his own experiences, where he'd been held for 3 years, and he was captured during the Battle of France. He was serving in the French army at the time as a corporal in the film and photo unit. Later in life, he would sort of brush off this experience, but he once answered that his escape from a prisoner of war camp was, quote, his favorite journey, although this ordeal undoubtedly shaped his future approach to work, traveling the world with this sort of stray dog freedom and focusing his work on his fellow former prisoners and other displaced people in the war. And he traveled throughout the world, photographing all different ways of life. In an image like this, you can really see this relationship to abstraction and surrealism and cubism, how he's arranging the windows. Oh, I guess the windows are already sort of wildly arranged, but using that space and how it relates to this genre. So Cartier-Bresson, he actually used painting and drawing as well to help him to unpack the events he witnessed during the war. Um, but it was ultimately the camera that he used to capture the stories of the Europeans who were coming to grips with a continent that um, had become irrevocably changed. And through portrait after portrait, each individual moment captured became a detailed picture of post-war Europe, which began to unify. So this term, the decisive moment, actually comes originally from a 17th century cleric, Cardinal de Retz, who had said, and the masterpiece of good ruling is to know and seize this moment. There's nothing in this world that does not have a decisive moment. And it's important to sort of talk about this because this idea of the decisive moment sounds like he was really a master at pushing the button at the right time. But in fact, he did make editorial choices. Here's an entire roll of film that is shot of this one hole in the wall, and how it changed. And you can see up in this area here, this image is the one that he ended up choosing. That's become famous, but there is a whole bunch of different options. And to talk about the editorial choices as a decisive moment as well is sort of important. In Mexico, a photographer, Manuel Alvarez Bravo, his most famous images are black and white depictions of nudes, folk arts, and street scenes, which are really imbued with a surrealist and supernatural presence. And he's considered mostly he was a real champion, or he was really championed by the surrealists in his imagery. His images evolved to fuse Mexican culture and symbols into a new photographic language, which creates icons that have become archetypes of Mexican culture. Um, his photos are recognized as unique photo poetry, where silence and light portray the human dimension. It was in 1927 when he met Tina Modotti, who you might remember from another lecture, who introduced him to her to a lively intellectual and cultural environment of other artists of various disciplines, people like Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and of course, Tina Modotti introduced him to her lover, Edward Weston, who encouraged Alvarez to continue photographing, saying to him in a letter, "Photography is fortunate in having someone with your viewpoint. It is not often I am stimulated to enthusiasm over a group of photographs." Um, and an image like this is really one of his images that really tap into this surrealist nature of his images. And this image is called La Buena Fama Durmiendo. And so this composition is of an indigenous woman who is sleeping face up, lying on a street, pavement street in full sun. The pavement is supporting her body, and this gray scale of the walls conveys the impression of wrinkled, blurry background. The linearity caused by the horizontality of the pavement that's supporting her body, and the verticality of the lines in the wall hold the frame and subjects and creates depth in the photograph. This woman's name is Alicia, and she's sound asleep in an unconcerned way and seems unaware of the potential danger that's represented here by the thorns next to her, as well as the vulnerable act of sleeping naked. And not only sleeping naked, obviously sleeping naked, bare-chested, and in fact with this strange gauze that's leaving her genitals exposed. And this picture, going back to surrealism, Andre Breton was sort of the champion, one of the early major figures in surrealism, and in the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, it's said it aimed to harmonize dreams and reality into one simultaneous state. Despite being aware of the mystery embedded in the act of dreaming, Breton believed firmly in conquering the unachievable amalgamation of dreams and wakefulness. And for the French poet these dreams have a linear and continuous structure that cannot be remembered faithfully in a waking state. So Breton, he saw this in immortalized in Bravo's photographs, where the viewer is in a conscious state and who is observing somebody who is sleeping and is in his or her dreams. Robert Doisneau, he had a long career of photographing on the street and has this very poetic approach, where he was recording French everyday life in a very playful and sort of surreal way. He was always charmed by his subjects and found amusing juxtapositions or oddities of human nature, where here's this policeman getting eaten by a door, or this, multiple gaze of the painter looking at the subject, somebody studying the painter, and the dog looking right back at us. He's initially studied engraving and lithography at École Estienne in Paris to learn crafts involving the book trade, but in the end claimed that the streets of the working class neighborhoods of Gentilly provided him his most important schooling, and they're just really funny, the really clever moments of looking at the painting and this guy's looking at the nude. This sort of perfect moment. When he was 16, he started photographing as an amateur, but he said that he was so shy that he first started photographing cobblestones before progressing to children and then adults. And he photographed a vast span of people and events, where he often juxtaposing conformist and maverick elements in images marked by an exquisite sense of humor. Again, as you see here, these helicopters with these nude statues that are completely covered in bird shit. And so he had this really anti-establishment values. And above all, he had this real love of humanity. But his picture, he himself was also a pretty shy and unassuming guy, which is sort of how his images read, as very polite, while their sense of humor is also very funny. This is out of place, but this is Lisette Model. I think, yeah, sorry, this wasn't supposed to be the lead-off image. This is Lisette Model, who was born in Vienna, where she studied painting with Arnold Schoenberg before moving to Paris. Or she studied music, excuse me, with Arnold Schoenberg before moving to Paris, and where she quit playing music in 1933 and discovered photography through her sister Olga and her friend Rogie André, who was André Kertész's wife. The next year, she and her husband, the painter Evza Model, they moved to New York City, where she would come into contact with figures like Alexei Brodovich and Beaumont Newhall, who were really champions in the photographic world. Beaumont Newhall, of course, becoming the curator of photographs at MoMA. And her best known work is a series of photographs she made with a 35mm camera of people on the Promenade des Anglais in Nice and on the streets in New York's Lower East Side. And her work definitely has a sort of poking fun at people aesthetic, looking at people who are strange and a little off. Her first pictures published in the United States were in the late 40s by Q, which was a weekly magazine devoted to activities in New York City. They were multiple reflections in plate glass windows of the fashionable Fifth Avenue shops. And sometime later, her Riviera pictures, like this one, were published in PM magazine under the title Why France Fell. The pictures created a sensation, but Model was appalled at the editorial slant that had been given them. I know why France fell, and it was for many complex reasons, she said. It certainly was not because of these rich bourgeois types. And as I mentioned, her work is notable for the emphasis on these peculiarities of normal people in everyday situations, and its direct, honest portrayal of modern life and its effect on the human character. And by getting close to her subjects, Model conveyed the sense of chance. The snapshooter's pictures have an apparent disorder and imperfection, which is exactly their appeal and their style. And she also taught photography in New York. Some of her students are people like Diane Arbus, which looking at her images makes perfect sense, and people like Larry Fink, who you should go look up because it all of a sudden lines up. And I believe this is the last person I'm showing you today is Harold or Doc Edgerton, who is known. He was actually a scientist, and he created what was called the stroboscope, which existed already, but he transformed the stroboscope from an obscure laboratory instrument into a common device. And he was really involved with the development of sonar and deep sea photography later, and his equipment was used by Jacques Cousteau. He received his Bachelor of Science from the University of Nebraska and then got his master's degree from MIT, where he became part of the faculty and got a PhD in 1931. So here is some of the equipment, a stroboscope. Stroboscope later would be called just a strobe, or in some cases even a flash. And the strobe light's ability to create optical illusions and really freeze motion enable people to see images that occur too fast for the human eye to discern. And when taking multi-flash photographs, the strobe light equipment could flash up to 120 times a second to give these metered looks and showing motion. And so between 1933 and 1966, Edgerton really revolutionized photography, science, military surveillance, and Hollywood filmmaking, and the media through his invention of this in the early 30s, the strobe in the early 30s. And the photographs that resulted from these experiments were then championed in 1933 as representative of the new objectivity, and the American counterpart to German Neuschatlicht, of the German idea of this. He obtained 45 patents for various strobe equipment and electrical engineering devices, and the stroboscope, which was a high-powered, repeatable flash device in 1949. And that's the last I have. I just want to say the last thing here with Edgerton is that this is obviously very different from a lot of the street work we have, but of course it's about stopping these moments and seeing things new, which is what this whole slideshow is about. So that's all I have for you today. This is a shorter lecture. And again, I just want to remind you, watch these things and get me your questions. And I will hopefully get you another one later this week or early next week. All right, I'll talk to you later.